And we are live. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'll be facilitating today. We have our expert panel, and what we wanted to talk about today was something that came up in our Rubberband forum. Now, if you're not familiar with Rubberband, we're actually an online support group for anyone working in the talent acquisition, the talent, recruitment, however you want to be defined, anyone working in that sector. We're an online community where as of today, 516 members and continuing to grow. If you haven't joined, please do. We love having these conversations. We're a supportive community and we're there to help each other everywhere we can. So we wanted to pull this together today because over the last week, there's been some interesting activity within the Rubberband community where we were alerted to some very interesting screening questions that candidates had encountered as they were going through a job application process. Some of our own community members had been applying for roles, and others were I guess identified to them from their networks, where their friends or ex-colleagues, etc., had reached out and said, "Hey, I was asked this really unusual question when I was applying for a job." So we wanted to pull an expert panel together to talk through those. And for context, a couple of those, and Mike will share some more in a moment, but a couple of those that really stood out was a question around, and a compulsory question, around the highest degree attained by your parents as you applied for a role. And another one that sparked quite a lot of conversation is a compulsory question around sexual orientation. Now, today, while we're having this panel, we're not here to be judgy, we're not here to criticise, we're just here really to discuss and provide our expertise and hopefully for you to make some informed decisions on what you should and shouldn't ask in your application screening questions. So welcome to our expert panel. I'll go around the room and introduce everyone, but I'll do it in order from what I can see. I can firstly see Annabel Rees, who is our organisational psychologist that's joining us today. So Annabel, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Eden, and thanks Rubberband for having me. So my background is psychologist going back of 30-something years. I've sort of moved more into, from, running a private practice, moving more into organisational psychology, currently managing director of Business Area, and we do HR, talent acquisition, EVP, business advisory, and digital marketing. So Business Area has been around for 8 odd years. And interestingly, we sort of scan the full gamut of some of the questions and the topics that you're covering today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Annabel. And thanks to Business Area for all the support for Rubberband. Since we launched, you've been there from day one. So we really appreciate all your support.
Pleasure.
Thank you. We also have Lauren with us today. Lauren's been a wonderful member of the Rubberband community and a very well-respected leader in talent. So I'd love, welcome, Lauren. I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Eden. Thanks for having me today. So my name's Lauren. I'm the Talent Sourcing and Branding Manager at TAL. So we are the leading life insurer in Australia, so about 3,500 people now. And my role, so I look after branding and employer brand strategy alongside our talent acquisition team. And I also look after our technology for TA. So I guess relevant to this discussion today, I'm responsible for setting up the screening questions that we have in our ATS when we're inviting applications from candidates, and application forms within our CRM as well. So we do have a number of diversity questions that we ask, which prompted, I guess, getting involved in some of the questions that were popping up in the group over the past couple of weeks. So really happy to be here and share what we're doing and also hear what other organisations are doing in this space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren, and welcome. And thank you for all your support. Up next, we have Alex Marriott, who's an old colleague of mine from about a decade ago, but also a dear friend. So welcome, Alex. Alex is our workplace relations risk expert today. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Eden, and so wonderful to be here with such an amazing panel. Thank you very much for the invitation, and so wonderful that despite having worked together, we still are friends and colleagues, and I'm grateful for that. So thank you very much for the invitation. So yeah, I'm here today, I suppose, to talk about the sort of risk and workplace relations elements of this particular topic that we've been exploring in the last couple of weeks with lots of really interesting experiences, including Mike's, which we'll hear about today. But my roles and my history to date span sort of, I suppose, all kinds of government, employer associations, private sector, and now I'm, as of today, have formally launched my consulting business. So it's lovely to be here. Hopefully I can add some insight. Thanks, Mike. And I think that's probably enough for now, but we'll keep exploring, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much. We're so lucky to have you. And as you said, last but not least, Mike, whose first day in his new job today. Mike is our, basically alerted this to us. Mike was a job seeker who first commented on some unusual questions that were coming up. So I'll hand over to you, Mike. And again, congratulations on day one of your new job.
Thank you. Thanks, Eden, and thank you to the Rubberband crew for having me here. Yeah, so my name's Mike. I'm the talent acquisition partner for Gallagher Bassett. We specialise in the insurance and administration. Prior to that, I've spent the better part of the last decade working as a recruitment contractor, going into businesses, helping them work on and refine various processes, helping them find hard-to-find candidates, and then trotting off to the next position. So from this perspective, because I've been not just recruiting, but keeping an eye on the market for myself as a recruiter, I'll primarily be approaching this roundtable from the perspective of a job seeker. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. And thanks for everything that you do within our community as well. And that's to everyone in the panel. We've got such a lovely sharing community that are always there to help each other, and each of you contribute in such a lovely way. So thank you so much. For anyone that is with us today on the LinkedIn Live, please pop in any questions and comments along the way. We will be doing a Q&A at the end, so pop them in there. And if you would like to keep those anonymous, just pop anonymous at the start. And if you wanted to direct it to someone specifically, just pop in who you'd like to direct your question to. If you would like it to be more a broader panel question, just pop panel in there as well. And I will do my best to facilitate those. Fingers crossed. Multitasking, Eden, is never my strong point, but let's see how we go. But look, Mike, thank you to my boss, Jess, for tuning in. Lovely to see you in the group. Hello, Jess, and yes, and Tony as well. Hello, Tony, welcome. See some comments coming through already. That's wonderful. So look, Mike, I think let's really start with you and tell us about, and I know you've been speaking to some other people around questions they've encountered as well. Tell us about that experience that you encountered, because it was quite surprising to a lot of us, some of the things that were popping up. Yeah, definitely. So towards the end of my job search, I began to see a lot of questions that were around family and what a family has to do with your current status in the workforce. One of the ones that stood out to me was asking, what was your parents' highest qualification? Now, for me, I've been independent from quite an early age, so I didn't necessarily understand the relevance of how any formal qualifications my parents have might bear upon the accomplishments that I've made in the recruitment industry so far. And in terms of that, Mike, did you have an opportunity not to answer that question, or was that a mandatory question for you? No, that was a mandatory question. I could not actually physically click on the next button until I'd selected one of those options. Okay. Well, look, I might hand over to Annabel now, because I think what you identified there in terms of your own independence and I guess pride around that independence, I can imagine would have been quite triggering. Annabel, what would you say from an org psych perspective? What kind of impact could that have on an end user being asked about their
I guess, families' qualifications over their own.
Yeah, look, I mean, to be honest, it's like anything, you know, there's a spectrum of responses, and people's different previous experiences all the way back from childhood or otherwise will have an impact on the response might be. Someone may not be triggered at all and may certainly laugh it off, or, you know, feel quite proud of what their parents might have achieved and reply a certain way. Someone might lie and say, well, I'm just going to select one of these options. But there is the potential for it to be quite jarring. You know, I think even, you know, seeing it come up in the forum, you know, a question like that and some of the other questions, at best, you know, they can be quite jarring. But I guess, you know, the other end of the spectrum is if, you know, there's a candidate that's had a particularly difficult childhood or upbringing, you know, they've probably done a lot of work to work through that trauma or to work through a process of being independent and having a sense of, you know, pride or otherwise around their achievements. And, you know, at a role level, it's hard to understand the relevance, you know, and there's certainly no, you know, really clear psychological research that would suggest your parental education is directly correlated to job performance. So, you know, it's potentially, you know, questions going too far or incorrect, but certainly an experience would be it's jarring. You know, I have a particular view of a company when I'm going through an application like that. I'm, you know, more likely to have a perceived view of, you know, if I was successful, you know, am I going to be judged for other parts of my background or otherwise? So, you know, it really starts to build a bit of experiences or circumstances that could be, you know, different to what the organisation is wanting to be perceived as.
And if I can just add to that quickly as well, certainly a number of the kids that I grew up with were wards of the state. So when someone's a ward of the state, it means that they're not necessarily attached to a parental unit or even foster homes or group homes. They are quite literally charges of the government, free to do what they need to do to survive. Now, a child or young person like that simply cannot answer those sorts of questions might be greatly affronted by a question like that, simply for the fact that they don't have the knowledge and they might not be able to continue with that in mind. With that in mind, how would you recommend addressing a barrier like that? And, you know, how can we at least provide an explanation as to how that is a valid recruitment question?
Yeah, look, Mike, I think I'm someone that you know, everyone that knows me, I'm kind of a glass half full kind of guy. Like I believe there is positive intention in terms of why people are asking that question. I personally believe this is trying to encourage people from a lower socioeconomic background to feel comfortable to employ, or they might have diversity targets and they're wanting to make sure that they're giving more opportunity to people. I know when I started in recruitment, there was very much an old boys Melbourne culture going on back in those days that, you know, private school educated people seem to get the preference, particularly, you know, those private schools that you all know about that are, you know, in those inner Melbourne suburbs that, you know, are very expensive to attend, and you tend to have very high profile parents. I think Melbourne did have a bit of a reputation, particularly in Australia, and I know that that's around in all states in the past. So, you know, I think a lot of it's coming out of the UK as well, where you do have those social classes, and you know, people could be unfairly discriminated due to the fact that they're more privileged than others. But I'd love to ask Alex your opinion around that, because you know, I'm trying to see the benefit of the doubt and trying to see where those intentions come from. But I also fear from a legal perspective that it's almost feels like reverse discrimination in a way. Like what are the legal risks around this? There's got to be some risk involved.
Eden, I think this has always been the basis of our friendship, is that you're glass half full and I'm glass half empty. But, you know, we meet somewhere in the middle, which is great. Look, for me, it's about, and, you know, taking on board what Mike and Annabel have contributed. And Mike, thanks again for sharing, because this has caused us all lots of reflection. For me, it's about saying, well, in the first instance, the fact that we're talking about it now, the fact that we're having to kind of speculate as to why these questions are being asked is really instructive. My advice is always that if you are going to step into that space where you're asking questions about people's demographics, so even questions about do they require adjustments in the process, that it's really important and useful. And again, as we've acknowledged already, in recruitment processes, this is your first kind of encounter with your future employer. So give people that context, give people that information, and provide that psychological safety from the very beginning. And my feeling is that these questions may in fact be a kind of terrible accident. And in that regard too,
I'm sorry, how do you have an accident with a question like that?
Unfortunately, it's not just rhetorical, Mike. I think a lot of businesses regard recruitment as a kind of reactive administrative process, and sometimes they'll buy a solution off the shelf. They won't have sort of done their requirements gathering, they won't have done the employee experience sort of design process. And so it might just be a question that's kind of hidden in the back end. And so someone's implementing this platform, they don't really understand this sort of, I suppose, compliance overlay on recruitment, because for them, this is a neutral, reactive kind of commercial business activity. Whereas in fact, it's not. That equal opportunity legislation overlays that process of recruitment and selection, because not only do you have the complex array of both federal and state anti-discrimination legislation and, you know, what we call equal opportunity legislation, but you also have candidates who could potentially make a general protections claim in the Fair Work Commission on the grounds that they may not have been offered a role because of a protected attribute. So across that sort of spectrum of both equal opportunity legislation, I really dislike that term, and, you know, your standard employment law stuff, you've got a range of obligations. So in that sense, this is really critical that that good process design takes into account employee experience, takes into account, to sort of Lauren's expertise, brand, takes into account the candidate experience from a perspective of safety and feeling included. And on that basis should really explicitly say why those questions are being asked, if in fact those questions are retained at all. So I think it's about all of those kinds of things. It's about understanding that recruitment is a core activity that you undertake, which is continuous with and part of the employment life cycle, that there is that compliance overlay, that we do need to put ourselves in the shoes of the person going through the process, and that if we are going to ask stuff, particularly about people's origins, that we provide that context and information. So you say, at organisation X, we are committed to this, we have this policy, we have this framework, you can find these here, and they're available, and provides that foregrounding around those questions. And I think then we wouldn't be here if that particular organisation had done those things. I mean, I'm glad we're here. I'm glad they did, because we wouldn't be here. But it really affirms the importance of understanding that this is not just a sort of reactive commercial thing. It is part of the employer brand, and it is also part of your risk management.
It's absolutely spot on. And look, Lauren, I know when we spoke about this, you know, offline, and, you know, you talked about, I guess, you know, what Alex was saying in terms of the process and the best practice and making sure you're going about it the right way. I'd be really keen to, you know, hear about some of the screening questions that you know, have implemented for positive reasons, and how you've done all of that work to ensure that what you're doing is going about it in the right way and has the candidate's best interests at heart.
Yeah, sure. So we've looked at the questions that we ask a couple of times over my time at TALS. So previously with the HRIS that we were using, and then again earlier this year when we implemented a new system. And I guess for us, the questions really tie into our broader D&I strategy. So we quite clearly separate the questions in our screening application form to questions in relation to recruitment, so around notice period, work rights, and so forth that are relevant in terms of the job application and assessment of experience against the role requirements. And then we've got a disclaimer, I suppose, that talks about why we are asking the questions that are to follow in relation to diversity, and that the information is held in strict confidence by our people and culture team, and that it's not visible to our hiring team, which is correct when you look into the system and how it's constructed. So I think most systems these days, most modern recruitment systems will allow you to separate your screening questions that you want your hiring team to see, and then also classify questions as diversity related questions. So it's quite clearly articulated that we're collecting the information to understand the demographic of our applicants in more detail, and that the hiring team, so anyone involved in hiring, can't see those answers. So when you go into an applicant record, you can't see any of that information that's attached. So I think that that's been a really important kind of technical piece to look at, as well as providing the option for candidates to say they prefer not to respond. So they're mandatory questions, but they all do have that option not to respond. We've got 3 questions, and we've aligned those to our 3 focus areas in our D&I strategy, which are gender, on Torres Strait Island, LGBTQ+. So really, I guess as we go through that full employee life cycle, as candidates become employees, they really clearly see that link between the focus areas in our D&I strategy and why we're collecting that information, which I think is really important, because there's a number of lots and lots of different questions that you could ask. We don't have a focus on socioeconomic diversity, for example, so we don't ask anything about that. So it's really relevant and ties into our overall strategy. We were also really careful to consult with our stream leads within the business around the wording of the questions, the wording of the responses that we provide that candidates can select. And there are also bodies externally that we partner with. So Pride and Diversity, Out for Australia, WGEA, Reconciliation Australia we're working with at the moment around objectives for our RAP. So I think if we kind of have all of those checks and balances to make sure that we are using the information correctly, but also presenting appropriately out to those demographics, we haven't had feedback come through that people are offended. So always, really interested in hearing those comments might come through, because I guess the last thing we want to do is feel like candidates are dropping off because of those questions that we're asking. But I think given the consideration and thought that's gone into how it's presented to candidates, we haven't had feedback come through that candidates are offended or the wording's jarring. So I think it will be something, we always need to keep an eye on, but we're quite comfortable with the way those questions are worded and just focusing on those 3 areas at the moment.
That's definitely right. And look, definitely some businesses have more transparency about their processes than others. 2 questions, and I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. How is it that with the technology that you're using at the moment, that you're able to identify the diverse persons if you don't actually link their diversity to their candidate profile in the first place? And secondly, David Giblisco in the comments here has asked, with regards to the initial question, could it be something that has to do with a lack of governance?
In answer to your first question around identifying the answers to the individual, we can't do that. We don't do that. So we don't want to be making decisions on who we progress through the recruitment process based on the answers in their application form. We are having some interesting discussions internally at the moment around, it's one piece understanding the candidate pool, but to better understand our workforce, if we want to ask those questions of existing employees or as people are onboarded, is that kind of that risk of people saying, I actually already answered that question in my application form. But we've made a pretty firm decision around not linking the two, given the upfront disclaimer that we're not going to individually identify people based on their responses.
And if I may, I think this is the sort of challenge too. For me, when you're asking those kinds of questions, do you actually say this is a diversity and inclusion section? For me, it's actually about saying this is demographics. And it's explaining that we capture, this section. In this section, we ask you questions about, demographic questions. Some of this data may inform our gender equality action plan, may inform our disability inclusion action plan and policy, may link to this, that, or the other. And I think that really it's not so much about the individual candidate, to your point, Mike, or sort of carrying through this very personal information, but it's really understanding it's, and again, I think that if you're not going to do this piece of work, then don't ask the question. For me, if you can have a data-driven approach to understanding who you're attracting as an employer, at what stages different cohorts are represented or underrepresented, and then also understand who's successful at the end of it. For me, it's about sort of mapping out those trends relative to those demographic markers, which you've picked up there, and being able to benchmark that over time. So, for example, using that kind of data set in the past, I've been able to identify that this particular part of the organisation needs to do more work, needs to uplift their capability around, unconscious bias and all those other things, because what we're noticing is that in that particular team, we keep hiring people from this cohort. So for me, it's about the benefit of that is not just about the individual person. And if I may just jump ahead, if you are talking about the individual person, for example, if you're asking questions about neurodiversity, or you're asking questions about adjustments that are required in the process, then my preference there is to, if you do capture that data, great. But to Lauren's point, if you're wanting to kind of ring fence that person's personal information, and make sure that your process is equitable and accessible, and again, that you're managing all the risk, then it's better if you can direct that person to discuss those adjustments with someone in your D&I team, or somebody that has adjacency to but sits outside of that process. So it's more about data-driven decisions.
Providing them the additional support.
That's right. So I think it's about understanding that relative to the question, why you're asking it, what it links back to, it may be information that needs to be attached to that person or not. And I think we also need to kind of remember that although you can, in Lauren's example, you can ring fence that stuff. You can say, well, this person can't see that because there's a wall in place. If you don't have that kind of system and you are gathering this information in the absence of an applicant tracking system or a more sophisticated platform, what are your back of house processes that, to that other question, support good governance of that risk and also support good governance of privacy, information, candidate experience, organisational capability, which would otherwise be more readily facilitated. Does that make sense? So for me, and again, it's about taking a step back. And anyone who knows me well knows that I say that all the time. But, always kind of taking that step back and reviewing and revising what you're doing and why you're doing it. And are you kind of aware of all the things that sit around that practice and making a decision?
Sorry, Alex. I mean, you mentioned bias. Another interesting thing is, when we're looking at, diversity and inclusion, we're also starting to potentially deal with minority groups that, for the most part, have a history of, potentially not trusting a system or an environment such as this. So also then you have the risk of getting a certain level of bias. So I'm comfortable to nominate myself as straight. Am I comfortable nominating myself with a different sexuality profile? I'm now less likely to submit that information. So the data in, data out, the data that's actually been provided, if at best, with no context, but at worst, no context. I would be wary, is it, actually skewed data, because, a user from a minority is very hesitant to provide that information because they've had, for the most part, a negative experience prior.
Absolutely. I think so. Again, it's those providing those assurances around privacy is important, but I think also creating different pathways. So lots of organizations have D&I strategies, and they might have benchmarks. They might be gathering this demographics information in support of that, but there's all these kinds of gaps. And often that can be about the fact that the only way you can apply for a job is to go through that system. So how do you also make your processes meaningfully accessible and equitable if you're dealing with cohorts with low digital literacy or these kinds of cultural barriers that mean that there's only a certain kinds of demographics of candidates, certain kinds of cohorts of candidates, I should say, that get past that first gate. So you're right. I agree completely.
I've also found, early on in my career, when I spent a lot of time working in call centers, when we had people coming in from minorities, people coming in on working holiday visas, often the workplace for them has been the first safe place, the first place that they've been able to express their sexuality, their gender identity, and even just how they see themselves as human beings, because of cultural pressures, familial pressures. You will only be like this because this is how we've done this for 20 plus generations. What do you think, Annabel and Alex, that we could do in not just in the recruitment place, but overall in the workplace to really encourage that sense of being yourself, being your truest possible self, so
bringing
that
your whole self to work, Mike.
So that then they'll go to their friends and go, this is a safe place for us. This is a good place for us to be us as well, which will ultimately then positively impact the business.
I'm sure Eden will be delighted to hear my response, which is that I think that you're like the mascot for good questions for future roundtables and panels. I think it's a great question, but I think it's a really, really big one.
It is a great question, absolutely. And I'd love to hear from Lauren as well, because we talked about this as well. So I'd love this question to go to Lauren as well, in terms of.
Sorry, Lauren, I wasn't trying to shut you out.
I might kick off with Lauren before we ask that question to Alex and Annabel, if that's all right, Mike, because one of the questions around, Lauren talked about the key focus areas, and one of them being LGBTIQ plus inclusion within the organisation you work. And we talked around, if I was asked this question, what experience I would expect from the organisation if I was asked to identify my sexual orientation, what that would actually mean in practice within the workplace that I was joining. And I know TAL have a really great program in place. So do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, sure. So we've got an internal employee group called TAL Pride, which was launched, must be about 5 or 6 years ago. It was not long after I joined TAL. And I guess that's one element to that kind of stream, and I guess ensuring that people do really feel comfortable bringing their whole selves to work, and that we're supporting initiatives that I guess are visible within the organisation to help support that. So big supporters of days such as Wear It Purple Day, which is on Friday, Ida Hobbit, which is in May, and the whole business really gets behind supporting those days. They're quite visible within the organisation. They're not led by people and culture. They're very much business-led employee groups. One of our GMs of claims leads TAL Pride, and we've got just a real mix of demographics, including a number of allies who are really very active in pushing the initiatives that we're running internally. So I know even individuals who have joined TAL who have have really had that comfort. So kind of met them on day one, may have been a little bit more reserved, and really hasn't taken them long to really kind of come outside of their shells and be able to share you know, their personal stories, and I guess help other people to feel like they can bring their whole selves to work as well. So TAL Pride's been a huge success. We do also run a D&I survey annually to understand the internal workforce as well. And I think we talk about providing you know, that opportunity for safe disclosure, and that's not just across that TAL Pride initiative, but also we're talking about that with some of our objectives around our reconciliation action plan as well, that people really need to feel like they're in an environment where it's safe for them to disclose their identity. Because I think, like someone mentioned before, maybe Annabel, often there are you know, people who have come from experiences where they may have been discriminated against, and it's really about building that trust and yeah, through the whole employee life cycle from their onboarding until they move on from TAL.
So we'll continue that because it was such a great question, Mike, and I'll ask Annabel and Alex their opinions of that. But a couple of the other mandatory questions, and I think there's kind of, forgive me if I'm wrong, Annabel, with this one, there's kind of a end user psychology around some of the questions that are asked where, you know, things like gender, we tend to understand why, as a candidate, we're being asked gender, and we tend to understand why it's important for organisations to ask whether their applicants are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. But I'm curious, in terms of, you know, we've talked about the wonderful program of TAL Pride. What are some of the other great you know, initiatives that you've seen in organisations that might be across gender, might be across you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander inclusion in the workplace? You know, can you talk us through some great examples to answer Mike's question?
Yeah, look, I think it's a complex question. So, you know, there's lots of facets to it. I think, you know, a colleague of mine often refers to authenticity being really at the heart of a lot of this. So don't ask the question really if you're not prepared to have, you know, information or experience that is connected to it. You know, I've at the poor end of the spectrum, I've been in, you know, I've seen in organizations where they'll talk about a RAP plan and it's literally you know, it's a document that goes in once a year, and, you know, there's no real engagement or activity, and, you know, it turns up on social posts and that's about it. Right through to, you know, businesses that, you know, it's bottom up. So, you know, whether it's any of our sort of inclusive elements, there's a groundswell from, you know, from within the organisation. I think that's probably key. Good organisations, you know, tend to have initiatives that aren't just owned by P&C or by leaders, that they've got active participation, ownership, and, you know, direction from individuals that are actually from those cohorts, or they've felt comfortable or supported in their work environment to be themselves to the extent that they want to reach out a hand to other individuals. And often I see that's where the most successful programs come from. You know, and to be honest, the less refined, again, often the more successful. You know, when there's too many rules, when there's too much structure, I think, you know, even someone that might fall in that cohort will actually often push against it and feel like it's been set up by the organisation. There's too many rules. I don't quite fit into that box. So I think having a level of flexibility, you know, really letting it be more groundswell, you know, and opting in where it makes sense to do so, I think is where you see the most successful programs.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I completely agree. And Alex, you raised a topic earlier around neurodiversity, and I do know that there have been some comments around, you know, questions around, do you identify as neurodiverse? And it's something that is being talked a lot, you know, more on how we can support not only job applicants going through an application process where, you know, there are some people that identify as neurodiverse where they feel they've got to tick every box and they've got to be completely accurate throughout their, you know, it's a different experience for them. And you know, it's one of those things where I personally haven't seen a lot of great programs in place in organisations to support our neurodiverse employees. I'm curious to know, have you seen any best practice or any great initiatives with any employers, anywhere at all around the world, I suppose? I'd love to hear about them.
Look, it's very much an emerging area, and I think it's something with which lots of businesses are grappling with, because you know, we are having more conversations about neurodiversity everywhere, and you know, the workplace, of course, is a macrocosm. So those similar sort of conversations happen there, and from the perspective of experience. I have a couple of comments which may not be particularly aligned to your question.
Sure.
I think the first of those is that increasingly that discussion about neurodiversity happens within a disability strategy. So, for example, in the public sector, Victorian public sector employers have a statutory obligation to implement a disability inclusion action plan. Okay. That obligation doesn't sit in the private sector, but a lot of employers, you know, internationally and within Australia, are opting to have a disability inclusion action plan. And again, to Lauren's point before about the pillars, you know, relative to the strategic priorities or the pillars that an organisation may or may not have at a given time, it may kind of fall in under that. Or it may be a pillar of a disability, words. What are they? Disability and inclusion strategy or policy or framework, and it may be a focus there. I think the thing is that, you know, and the concept here, of course, is that disability arises relative to context. That's something I say all the time. This context is really important. So if you are going to start talking about it, it's really incumbent upon you as an employer, again, to be really authentic about asking the question, to actually understand why you're asking about it, and also to know what you're going to do with that information you're gathering when you've got it. So are you coming at it from this is a disability or this is a medical thing, to this might be something that enlivens our obligation to make reasonable adjustments, or this is about, you know, just celebrating our interpersonal differences and diversity. Yeah. So I think it's, you know, and the other comment I want to make briefly, and it's much more in Annabel's space, is that in Victoria from the 1st of July, there are new and very robust statutory obligations. I can't talk, I've just given up, around psychosocial safety. Okay, so everywhere we look, that positive duty of employers to provide a safe workplace, that positive duty to ensure that your workplace and your workplace practices are not discriminatory. There's just a burning platform there to get ahead of the wave of regulatory change and really become quite strategic about this. And I think, to Annabel's point, you really want to do this bottom up. So if your demographics are demonstrating that you've got these kinds of cohorts who are interested in working with your business, how do you support your leaders to manage and supervise and engage with your neurodiverse cohorts? What do you do with your recruitment processes? So it's a big question. So I think that if you've got that little tick box on your form, it requires a lot of background capability building. And certainly if you are asking that question and someone says, well, I told you that then, and I'm now asking for this stuff, what's up? It's also that thing about lining up candidate experience, employee experience, business strategy, brand. It needs to be holistic. It can't afford to be tokenistic, because it does. It treads that line around, well, in your business, what does this mean? And why are you asking, and what are you going to do about it?
Absolutely.
Also,
well, look, I've sorry, Mike, you go.
I'm seeing here in the comments, Daniel Lissett has said, it's better for the initiative to come from existing managers, not people and culture, too formal and not integral to the business, in brackets, candidate perspective. What does the panel think of that observation?
Look, my first point is to say that in a lot of organisations where you have an absence of that sort of overarching structure, policy, capability, you might have manager-led culture or manager-led practices, which are amazing. And ideally, those people are kind of advocating up for sort of globalization of those practices across the business, if you like. In the alternate case, this is glass half empty, Alex, as opposed to glass half full, Eden. You know, you might have people who are kind of ultimately engaging in practices that might not be aligned or might not be appropriate. So I think it's, for me, I think for the candidate preference is to kind of directly engage with managers and to understand what their offering is. But I think understanding that you are participating in an experience as a candidate with a business for whom this stuff is important, a business that's dedicated time and resources to building capability in this regard and is going to afford you a great experience no matter with whom you're interacting in the business, then I feel that's something that's more powerful and more meaningful and more authentic.
Excellent. Good. That's a great answer, Alex. Thank you. Look, this has certainly been very thought-provoking, and it's, you know, one of those areas where the more you talk about it, the more questions get raised. You know, and I think everyone that has joined the live today will be thinking about this over the coming days and weeks. So I really wanted to just finally reach out to each member of the panel, and if you were someone that has joined us today or someone that is watching the recording and they don't know where to start, what would your advice be in terms of everything that we've covered off here? Those screening questions, the experience of the candidate, the experience of the employee when they start. If you were a talent acquisition manager and you were concerned, or you were just curious around your own process, Annabel, where would you advise them to start?
I think I'd go tread lightly. I think if you're not sure, if you haven't got the practices to back it up and you haven't done the work around your discovery in terms of your branding and your EVP and what your business stand for, then I'd be really cautious jumping into some, you know, questions on an ATS. So slowly and surely. I think it's a sophisticated area and not something to be taken lightly.
So your advice would be to switch them off until you have done that work to switch the appropriate ones on. Is that a good way to?
Absolutely. Yep.
Excellent. And Lauren, over to you. What would your advice be to anyone that's you know, that's concerned or curious around their own process and what you feel they should be doing?
I would just say don't feel like you need to tackle it alone. I think you know, even over the past couple of years with the likes of the Rubberband group that we're in, collaboration between different talent acquisition teams, I think, you know, people are really open to sharing their knowledge and sharing what they're doing within their own organisation, you know, for the greater benefit of the industry. I think there used to maybe be a little bit more kind of protection over what one's doing in one organisation compared to others, but I think people are more than happy to help. So I'd say, yeah, reach out to people within the industry and also lean on industry bodies who have a lot of resources in relation to educating hiring managers, educating people involved in recruitment around, you know, appropriate questions and things like that. So I'd say, yeah, do that groundwork, reach out to people around you, and through that you should be able to kind of gather best practice and not run into those unfortunate kind of mistakes and accidental questions and things which we mentioned, which often have the best intent but potentially haven't been researched enough.
Completely agree. That one thing, if anyone out there could take away, is please never be afraid to reach out for help. I completely agree, Lauren. You know, all of my roles, I think, have been a stretch role that I've stepped into. And I think never assume that you know everything. If you're unsure, reach out, ask for opinions, ask for help, ask the experts. It's really, really important. I think the Australian community in talent, in recruitment and broader HR is a very generous community. There's always someone that's there to help you. So never be afraid to reach out for help. I think that's really wonderful advice. How about you, Alex? What are your final thoughts or your final advice for anyone watching today?
I'll try to be uncharacteristic and make it quick. I think I think it's also understanding that you know, there are regulators, you know, which regulate this space, but their job's also seriously, I can't talk anymore. Their job is also to provide advice. So, you know, you can contact the Victorian Human Rights Commission or your state-based Human Rights Commission. There's lots and lots of really good resources available from the AHRC. Yeah, and look, I think it's about, you know, as a starting point, being curious, asking questions, you know, just kind of getting some advice. And I think that if you're in a talent role and you're kind of subject to the vagaries of organizational sort of policy and you've got questions about it, you know, be curious, ask questions, but also, again, I just think the critical thing is we have so much shared knowledge in communities like Rubberband, and just to reach out and use those networks because it provokes lots of really great conversations. I think we've seen that tonight. So ask questions, do your research, capital R research, and you know, just keep learning. Wonderful.
And finally, from our job seeker, who is no longer a job seeker, again, congratulations on day one today, Mike. What would your final thoughts be for any of our watchers, listeners?
Ask your people. Mm-hmm. I think at times in talent acquisition, we get so stuck behind process and, you know, we're we're fixers. We see something that's wrong and we instantly want to try and make it better for everybody. But, you know, doing your research and going to the governing bodies is great and definitely something that you should do. But we're people that are looking for people, and the people that are going to know more than anyone what would have made the experience better for them or what could make it better for them is the people that are currently there. So how do we attract neurodiverse people? How do we attract people, you know, LGBTIQ community to come in and be a part of this? Put simply, we ask them.
I think it's absolutely spot on. I think one piece of advice that I give on so many different topics around experience, particularly today we're talking about candidate experience, is apply for that role yourself. Ask your senior leadership to apply for the role. Ask your team to apply for the role. So many teams fall in the trap of being on the treadmill and they actually don't go through the experience themselves. So if you're not sure where to start there. And think to yourself, how do I feel being asked this question? How could I potentially feel being asked this question? How have I found this experience? How has it affected me emotionally? Has it allowed me to put my best foot forward in my application? Do I feel like I've been able to bring my true self to my application? Make sure that you go through that process. I think it's critical. But everyone, Annabel, Lauren, Alex, and Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like we could have spoken for another 3 hours and still not gone through a topic like this. So if you want to hear more, if anyone that's out there, please join the Rubberband group. We'll continue this conversation there. But once again, thank you to our wonderful panel and thank you for all the support that you give to Rubberband.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Eden. It's great to be here.
Thanks for organising.
Thanks, Eden.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.